My name's Ethan. I'm a 27-year-old guy from Boston. I'd been bouncing around between jobs for a while, never really finding anything that stuck. But when I saw the listing for a crew member on a shipping vessel, I thought, why not? It paid well, offered long stretches of time at sea, and I figured it would be a good way to clear my head. What I didn't expect was for it to become a nightmare. The ship, an old cargo vessel called the Mistral, had been around for decades. It wasn't fancy, but it got the job done. When I first boarded, I was greeted by the captain, an old man named Captain Graves. His face was weathered from years at sea, and he had this unsettling air about him, like he knew things he'd never share with anyone. There were 5 of us on the crew. Myself, a guy named Marcus from Detroit, a young woman named Sophie who handled communications, and 2 engineers, Tim and Greg. We all got along pretty well, at least in the beginning. The first week or so was pretty normal. We spent our days maintaining the ship, making sure the cargo was secure, and dealing with the usual challenges of life at sea. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then, Captain Graves called us all together one evening, just after dinner. He looked at each of us, his eyes dark, serious. "There are a few protocols you need to follow while you're on this ship," he said. His voice was deep, almost like a growl. "These aren't negotiable. If you break them, things happen." I remember laughing at first, thinking it was just some old sailor superstition, but the look on his face stopped me cold. "There are 3 rules," he continued. "The first, never, and I mean never, be on deck alone after midnight. The second, if you hear knocking on your cabin door between 3 and 4 a.m., do not open it, no matter what. And the third, if you see anything, or anyone, out at sea that looks like a person, ignore it. You hear me? Ignore it." We all exchanged uneasy glances, but no one questioned him. Maybe we should have. The first couple of nights after that were quiet. Nothing strange happened, and I started to think the captain was just trying to scare us. But on the 4th night, I woke up around 3:30 a.m. My cabin was small, barely enough room for a bed and a tiny desk. The sound of the ocean was usually soothing, but that night, there was something different. Something off. I heard it then, a soft knock on my door. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then it came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. My heart started racing. I remembered the captain's warning, "Do not open the door." I lay there frozen, listening. The knocking didn't stop. It continued, slow and steady, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side knew I was awake. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to ignore it, to stay put. But the knocking, it was relentless. I don't know how long it went on, but eventually, it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. The next morning, I asked Sophie and Marcus if they had heard anything. Sophie shook her head, but Marcus looked pale, like he hadn't slept. He avoided my eyes and muttered something about bad dreams. I didn't push him, but I knew. He'd heard it too. A few days later, something even stranger happened. It was around 11 p.m., and I was on deck with Greg, one of the engineers. We were doing a routine check of the cargo when Greg suddenly stopped. He was staring out at the horizon, his face pale. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. There, just beyond the ship, was a figure. At first, I thought it was someone swimming, someone lost at sea. But as I looked closer, I realized they weren't swimming. They were floating, perfectly still, their head barely above the water, eyes wide open, staring straight at us. Greg took a step forward, like he was going to call out to them, but I grabbed his arm. "No," I whispered. "Ignore it." His face twisted in confusion, but then I saw the recognition in his eyes. He remembered the captain's rule. If you see anything, or anyone, out at sea, ignore it. We stood there, frozen, watching as the figure slowly disappeared beneath the waves, like it had never been there at all. When we told the captain the next morning, he didn't seem surprised. He just nodded and told us to forget about it. But how could I? How could any of us forget something like that? Things only got worse from there. Every night the knocking would return. Every night it seemed to get louder, more insistent. And every night I fought the urge to open the door. I knew, deep down, that if I did, I wouldn't be standing here now, telling you this story. One night, around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside my cabin. Slow, shuffling footsteps, like someone was dragging their feet. I didn't dare open the door, but I peeked through the tiny crack between the floor and the door. I saw shadows. More than one. They were moving slowly just outside, but there was no sound, no voices, just silence, except for those footsteps. I stayed awake until sunrise, too terrified to sleep. When I finally ventured out, I found Marcus in the galley, staring at the floor. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Did you hear them?" I asked quietly. He nodded. "It's getting worse," he muttered. "We need to leave this ship." I wanted to agree with him. Every part of me wanted to get off the Mistral and never look back. But we were in the middle of the ocean. There was nowhere to go. That's when Sophie came in, looking as pale as we felt. "The radio," she whispered. "It's not working. I've been trying to get through to someone for hours, but nothing. It's like we're completely cut off." Captain Graves didn't seem to care. He just told us to follow the protocols and everything would be fine. But I knew, and I think the others did too, that the protocols weren't there to keep us safe. They were there to keep it out, whatever it was. Now, as I'm writing this, the knocking has started again. It's louder tonight, more frantic, like it knows I'm talking about it. And the footsteps, they're back too. But this time they're not outside my door. They're inside. The footsteps inside my cabin were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if whatever was in the room with me was sucking the life out of it. I didn't look up. I didn't want to see it, whatever it was. But I could feel it, a presence, something dark and cold hovering just out of sight. The footsteps stopped, and for a brief moment the room was deathly silent. Then a whisper, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Ethan?" It knew my name. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle in my body tensed. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything other than lie there, paralyzed with fear. But I couldn't. The air felt like ice, chilling me to the bone. The presence lingered just inches away, and I could feel its gaze on me, even though I couldn't see it. Seconds turned into minutes, or maybe it was hours. I couldn't tell. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that moment. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the presence was gone. The room felt empty again, but the fear remained. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, the sun was streaming through the tiny porthole in my cabin. For a moment, I thought I had dreamed it all, but then I saw them. Footprints. Wet, muddy footprints leading from the door to the side of my bed. And they weren't mine. That was the last straw. I wasn't the only one who had experienced strange things, and I knew the others were just as scared as I was. We needed to get off this ship. Now. I found Marcus and Sophie in the galley again. They were pale, eyes wide with fear. Marcus looked like he hadn't slept in days, his hands trembling as he clutched a mug of coffee. "We need to talk to the captain," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to get out of here." Sophie nodded. "I tried the radio again this morning. Still nothing. It's like we're completely cut off." Marcus stared at the table, silent. I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that had been gnawing at me for days. "It's not going to let us leave," he whispered. I didn't want to believe him, but deep down I knew he was right. We went to see Captain Graves, but when we reached the bridge, he wasn't there. In fact, the entire bridge was empty. The ship was running on autopilot, headed somewhere. We didn't know where, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. "Where is he?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. We searched the ship, but there was no sign of the captain. It was like he had vanished. The only thing we found was his cabin door, locked from the inside. Panic started to set in. Without the captain, we were alone, adrift in the middle of the ocean with no way to communicate with the outside world. And whatever was haunting this ship, it wasn't going to let us leave. That night, the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't just at my door. It was everywhere, every cabin, every corridor. It was like the entire ship was alive with the sound of relentless, pounding knocks. I stayed in my bed, clutching the blanket like a shield. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was happening, why this was happening. But there were no answers, only fear. Then, the voices started. Not whispers this time, but loud, echoing voices that filled the air around me. They were speaking in a language I didn't understand, guttural and harsh, like something ancient and malevolent. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but the voices just got louder, more insistent. And then, through the chaos, I heard my name again. "Ethan." It was the same voice from before, cold and mocking. I knew it wasn't human, couldn't be human, but it was inside my head, and no matter what I did, I couldn't make it stop. The next morning, we found Greg, one of the engineers. He was dead, lying in a pool of his own blood in the engine room. His eyes were wide open, frozen in terror, and his hands were covered in deep, jagged cuts. It looked like he had tried to claw something, someone, away from him. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that anyone else had been there. But I knew better. I knew that whatever had killed Greg wasn't something we could fight. It wasn't something we could see. Panic spread through the remaining crew like wildfire. Tim, the other engineer, locked himself in his cabin and refused to come out. Sophie and Marcus were barely holding it together, and I could feel my own sanity slipping away, piece by piece. That's when I made the decision. We had to abandon ship. It didn't matter if we were in the middle of the ocean. It didn't matter if we didn't have a way to contact anyone. Staying on board was a death sentence. We gathered what supplies we could, loaded them into one of the lifeboats, and prepared to leave. But as we lowered the boat into the water, something stopped us. It was Sophie. She was staring out at the horizon, her face pale as a ghost. "What is it?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't answer. She just pointed. We followed her gaze, and that's when we saw it. A ship. Another ship, almost identical to the Mistral, sailing just a few miles away. At first, we thought it was a rescue, but then we noticed something strange. The ship wasn't moving. It was just sitting there, motionless on the water. And then I saw it. On the deck of the ship, standing perfectly still, was a figure, dressed in the same uniform as us, staring right at us. It was me. For a moment I stood there frozen, staring at the figure that was me. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was exactly me, down to the smallest detail. My heart hammered in my chest as I struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. Marcus must have seen it too, because his face went as white as a sheet. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. Sophie backed away, her eyes wide with terror. "It's not real. It can't be real." But it was real as the cold, salty air stinging my face and the creaking of the Mistral beneath my feet. The figure on the other ship didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, staring back at us like a reflection in a twisted mirror. "Is that you?" Marcus finally asked, his voice barely audible. I couldn't answer. My mouth was dry, my thoughts racing. How was it possible? How could there be another me standing on that ship, watching us, as we stared in shock, a deep, low sound echoed across the water. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of the ship. It was something else, something alive. It vibrated through the air, deep and guttural, like a growl from the depths of the ocean. "Get in the boat," I whispered. My voice was barely more than a breath, but Marcus and Sophie didn't need any convincing. They scrambled into the lifeboat, and I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. We started lowering the boat into the water, but as we did, the other ship, my ship, began to move. Slowly at first, like a shadow drifting across the water. The figure on the deck remained still, watching us, but I could feel something shifting in the air. The growling sound grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the bones of the ship. And then it hit me. It wasn't a ship. It was something else, something alive. The growling wasn't coming from the water, it was coming from under the ship. As the lifeboat touched the surface of the ocean, the water around us began to churn. Waves crashed against the side of the Mistral, tossing the lifeboat like a toy. "What's happening?" Sophie screamed, clutching the side of the boat as it rocked violently. "I don't know," Marcus shouted back. "Just row! We need to get out of here!" We grabbed the oars and started rowing as fast as we could, but it was like rowing through mud. The water resisted us, thick and heavy, as if something was pulling us back toward the ship. I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. The figure on the other ship. It wasn't alone anymore. More figures had appeared, all of them identical to the crew of the Mistral. There was Marcus, Sophie, Greg, even Captain Graves standing with the others, their blank eyes fixed on us. "Row faster!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. But it was no use. The water around us was boiling now, bubbling and frothing like something massive was stirring beneath the surface. Then, without warning, a massive wave rose up behind us, towering over the boat. We barely had time to react before it crashed down, flipping the lifeboat and plunging us into the freezing water. The cold hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from my lungs. I struggled to the surface, gasping for breath, the salt water burning my eyes and throat. "Sophie! Marcus!" I shouted, my voice lost in the roar of the waves. I couldn't see them. The water was too rough, the darkness too thick. I thrashed around, trying to find something to hold on to, but there was nothing. Just the endless churning sea and the sound of that awful growling beneath me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something large, something massive, was rising from the depths of the ocean. It wasn't a wave. It was something else. Something alive. A shadow, bigger than anything I had ever seen, began to emerge from the water. I could barely make out its shape, but it was enough to know that it wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could understand. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow disappeared beneath the surface, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out from the cold, because the next thing I knew, I was lying on a beach, the sound of waves crashing in the distance. I was alive. But I was alone. There was no sign of Sophie or Marcus, no sign of the Mistral. Just me, lying on the sand, staring up at the sky, trying to make sense of what had happened. For days I wandered the beach, hoping to find some clue, some explanation. But there was nothing. The only thing I found was a single wet footprint in the sand, leading away from the shore. And it wasn't mine. I'm writing this now as a warning. If you ever find yourself on a ship called the Mistral, don't board it. Don't even think about it. Whatever is out there on the ocean, whatever it is that took my crew, it's still out there, and it's waiting. But the question that haunts me the most, the question that keeps me awake at night, is this: who or what was standing on that other ship? Now I have to ask you, what do you think happened to Sophie and Marcus? Could they still be out there somewhere? Or is something else controlling them? And more importantly, where do you think this other ship came from? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Also, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to hear from you. I spent weeks, months maybe, trying to figure it out. I went through every log, every record, every piece of evidence I could find. But there was nothing. No trace of the Mistral, no report of its disappearance, no missing crew, nothing. It was as if the ship had never existed, as if the sea had swallowed it whole and erased it from reality. I reached out to other sailors, old-timers who had been around longer than I had. But whenever I mentioned the Mistral, they gave me the same look, half disbelief, half fear. They would shake their heads and mutter about old superstitions, about things better left alone. And then they would always tell me the same thing. Some ships aren't meant to return. Months turned into years, and I tried to move on. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. The dreams started soon after I got back on land. At first, they were vague, just shadows and water, the sound of waves crashing endlessly. But then they got clearer, too clear. In my dreams, I was always back on the ocean. I could hear the creaking of the Mistral under my feet, smell the salt in the air, feel the cold wind on my face. And always, without fail, I would see them, the figures. They were standing on the deck of the other ship, watching me, waiting. But here's the thing. The longer I stayed away, the less I started to recognize them. They weren't just copies of my crew anymore. They had started to change. Their faces became twisted, their eyes hollow. It was as if the ocean itself had warped them, made them into something else. And then there was me. In every dream, I saw myself, standing with them, watching myself from across the water. And every time I looked a little less human. I kept quiet about the dreams, tried to bury the memories, but they wouldn't stay buried. One night, after a particularly vivid dream, I woke up with an overwhelming sense of dread. I knew something had changed. I wasn't sure how, but I could feel it. I rushed to the mirror, expecting to see my reflection. But what I saw wasn't me. My reflection was wrong, just like in the dreams. My face was slightly off, like the features didn't quite fit together the way they should. My eyes were cold, empty, and staring back at me with a knowing look. It was as if the person in the mirror wasn't me at all, but something that had taken my place. I stumbled back, shaking, heart pounding, and in that moment, I knew. I couldn't run from it anymore. A few days later, I got an anonymous note slipped under my door. It was written in messy, scrawled handwriting. No signature, no indication of who sent it. It only had one line. "The Mistral sails again." Now I'm sitting here, writing this, knowing that I can't avoid it any longer. I don't know what's waiting for me out there, but I'm going back. Back to the sea, back to where it all began. There's something I need to face, something I need to understand. Maybe I'll find Sophie and Marcus. Maybe I'll find that other ship. Or maybe I'll find myself, the version of me that's been haunting my dreams. But whatever happens, I have to know the truth. I leave you with one final question. Would you board the Mistral? Thank you for staying with me through this story. It's a journey I never expected to take, and I hope you found it as unsettling as I have. And as always, don't forget to comment. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Could you face the unknown? Would you follow the call of the sea? And one more thing. Tell me, where are you watching this from? Let me know in the comments.